Good morning. Today's lecture is on women and religion in the 15th through 19th centuries, primarily in Europe and also in the United States. This is the lecture following the one on women in medieval Christianity. So in this lecture, we're moving from the year 1500 up through the 1800s. So the big event that starts this new period is the end of the medieval world. And there are actually three events that precipitate the collapse of the world as it was known for roughly 1,000 years, and that begin the modern era. And the first of these is the invention of the printing press in Germany. The Gutenberg Bible is printed, and this is around 1450, a little earlier. So this changes the world because much more learning is available to more people. No longer does each manuscript have to be copied out by hand, and so there are more books available and more communication is occurring. The second event, of course, is the voyage of Columbus to the New World and all the other explorers that discover that there is another entire part of the earth. There are continents that they had not known about, and this creates a big jump in thinking and in research and study and in religion. The third big event is the beginning of the Reformation. So people are wanting to change Catholicism as it has been known for hundreds of years. And the most famous of these, of course, is Martin Luther, who has 99 complaints that he writes and he posts on a church door, the Wittenberg door in Switzerland. And so these three events change the world. So we're now dealing with a world that is not exclusively Catholic. There's much more communication and there's more knowledge about various peoples and religions that exist in the world. So the first event in this era that we'll be talking about is the persecution of witches. So this occurred over about a 300-year period, from roughly 1450, although women were persecuted earlier, notably Joan of Arc and the Beguines in the Netherlands. But from around 1450 to 1750 of the Common Era, perhaps anywhere from 20,000 persons to 200,000 persons were arrested, tried, and killed. 80% of these people were women. Scholars have tried to figure out why this widespread fear and misogyny occurred. Basically, it occurred in an era of profound social change and economic change. So when there's change, there's fear, and the other factor that made this whole persecution possible was increasingly efficient centralized governments and bureaucracies within the church. So efficient that they could kill people. So gender norms were being religiously and rigidly policed, as well as behavior related to sexuality, procreation. So if a woman was not safely confined within a marriage, what was she doing, and was her behavior not only sexually dangerous, but perhaps dangerous in other ways to the towns that she lived in. So the most famous book of this era is called The Hammer Against Witches, the Malleus Maleficarum. And it was a handbook for inquisitors or people who thought they might have a problem with witchcraft in their community or in their area. And so it was a guide to how to investigate, what to look for, what were the signs of a witch, how to conduct a trial. And it's just an incredible document full of misogyny and preoccupation with dangerous sexuality and with the devil. So if a baby was born, did the woman sleep with the devil, or did she sleep with someone in the community? I mean, there were all kinds of strange beliefs involved. So in the United States, the most famous location for these trials and policing of witches is Salem, Massachusetts. And this is a book that includes a few chapters on the trials in Massachusetts, as well as the whole witchcraft era of 300 years. So this is called Women in Religion, the original source book of women in Christian thought, and it was edited by Elizabeth A. Clark and Herbert Richardson. So I'll read you an excerpt of some of the trial and some of the testimonies in the trials. So the first sample that I'd like to read you is from the Malleus Maleficarum, and this is a section, Part 1, Question 6. Why is it that women are chiefly addicted to evil superstitions? And the title of this section is Witches Who Copulate with Devils. So the whole section is, it says, there is also, concerning witches who copulate with devils, much difficulty in considering the methods by which such abominations are consummated. Yes, difficult to figure that out. Another paragraph begins, why superstition is chiefly found in women. Why a greater number of witches is found in the fragile feminine sex than among men. So part of the answer in this Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of the Witches, is that women are feebler both in mind and body, so it's not surprising that they should come under the spell of witchcraft. They go back and quote some Latin authors, such as Terence, who says women are intellectually like children. Then, leaning on Aristotle, the author of this book says, the natural reason is that she is more carnal than a man, as is clear from her many cardinal abominations. It should be noted that there was a defect in the formation of the first woman, since she was formed from a bent rib, that is, a rib of the breast, which is bent, as it were, in a contrary direction to a man. And since through this defect she is an imperfect animal, she always deceives. So that's just a sample of the kind of pseudoscientific reasoning and logic that occurs in the Malleus Maleficarum. I'll now read you an excerpt from the testimonies in some of the documents from Salem, Massachusetts. So here's a dialogue between Sarah Good, who is being examined by John Hartthorne and Jonathan Curran. So Hartthorne asks her, Sarah Good, what evil spirit have you familiarity with? And Sarah says, none. He says, have you made no contract with the devil? She says, no. He says, why do you hurt these children? She says, I do not hurt them. He says, who do you employ then to do it? She says, I employ nobody. He says, what creature do you employ then? No creature, but I am falsely accused. Then he asks her, why did you go away muttering from Mr. Paris, away from his house? She says, I did not mutter, but I thanked him for what he gave my children. And then again, the inquisitor asks her, have you made no contract with the devil? And she says, no. So it just continues in kind of that framework until the question, who do you serve? And she says, I serve God. And he says, what God do you serve? She says, the God that made heaven and earth. And the comment by the person who wrote down this trial is, although she was not willing to mention the word God, her answers were in a very wicked, spiteful manner, reflecting and retorting against the authority, the man asking her the questions, with base and abusive words, and she was taken in many lies. It was here said that her husband had said that he was afraid she was either a witch or would be one very quickly. So then he says, she is asked why her husband said that. And, the husband is asked that. And the husband answered, it was because of her bad carriage, which is bad behavior toward him. And the husband says, he says, I may say with tears that she is an enemy to all good. So that's just a little sample of a woman being accused of witchcraft on the basis of rather skimpy evidence and mostly some ill will from her husband and from the community. So that was a phenomenon that we need to be aware of, is the era of the actual persecution of witches and the belief that that this was a widespread problem that could be stamped out by killing or burning witches. And I'll just make a footnote that the fear of witches is still occurring in many parts of the world today, especially in rural communities. There are parts of Africa where people are still being accused of putting spells and causing harm through witchcraft. So that's something to know about. Okay, so that's one thing that is happening from the 15th century right up through the 18th century, when it finally, these trials stop happening. The other big phenomenon we need to know a little bit about is the Reformation. So the changes that were demanded from the Catholic Church by those who felt that certain things weren't being done right. So Martin Luther was one of the leaders of the Reformation. And let's look at his views on marriage and celibacy, which are actually also recorded in this book. So this is chapter Chapter 8, the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Response. So I'll read a few excerpts from this book. Basically, Martin Luther felt that the convents and the monasteries should all be closed, that the people who were there probably weren't really living holy lives, that perhaps they were living in luxury, perhaps they were involved sexually when they shouldn't be, according to their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So his solution was within Protestantism to not have any organized living groups for women who were celibate, not married. And there was also a widespread desire to close down monasteries and convents in general. So Martin Luther felt that everyone has the duty to marry, and women should all be childbearing. Nuns should become wives. So convents were actually closed, and some women were forced to either marry or find other living arrangements. So this had a negative impact on women whose source of education and writing and reading was all rooted in living in a monastic environment and having access to a library. This also had a negative impact on women as far as their power, because an abbess would have power over a large area, the lands that the abbey owned, and perhaps in the case of a double monastery, power over both a men's abbey and a women's abbey next door to each other. So there were women who were the rulers of double monastic units. So these women lost status, they lost power. So that was one problem that occurred for women with the Protestant Reformation. Let's look at another leader of the Reformation, John Calvin. So Calvin not only wanted everybody to marry, but he wasn't quite so much emphasizing it as a duty. He said sexuality is good within marriage. It's okay for the husband and wife to delight in each other. In other words, to have sex for the pleasure of having sex, not merely for procreation. You remember in the previous lecture we mentioned St. Augustine, who felt that sexuality was only good if it was done with the purpose of having children. So therefore, if you're doing it at a time of the month when you can't conceive, or if you're doing it with the use of some other means to make sure you don't conceive, then that's not okay. But anyway, Calvin says, yes, sexuality is good. However, these Protestants took the Bible very seriously. They were getting everyone to study and read the Bible, whereas in the era of Catholic leadership in religion, in Christianity, there wasn't Bible study. There wasn't a printing press. There weren't Bibles in every home. But it was also felt that people shouldn't be studying and interpreting the Bible for themselves. John Calvin, however, and Luther and the others who were trying to change the church to make a relationship with Jesus a more personal experience and to make understanding the Bible more widespread. These people read their scriptures and they said, oh, the man should be superior to the woman in the home. The woman should be there to help, to obey, and be subject to the man. So we've already looked at the passages that they were using in this argument. And we've looked at alternative understandings of those passages. So that was a problem for women as far as not only being subject in the home culturally, but having a biblical authority to back that up. Another problem was that in this new movement to change the church, women were denied ordination. They were not allowed to preach or to serve in church government. So the Reformation was great for some people and in some ways, but as far as opening things up for women, it really didn't do that. However, there were still books available, so women as well as men had access to more books, and they were being encouraged as Christians to read and think for themselves. More people had access to education and to their own personal study of the Bible. So women benefited from this change with the Reformation as well as men. So they lost as far as the opportunity to get an education in a monastic environment, and as far as having the social and spiritual leadership of being a nun or an abbess, but they gained in terms of having more access to the Bible and being able to study it for themselves. Some women resisted being forced to leave the convents and denied the accusations that there were women in a convent who were sexually not celibate or who were living in too much luxury. So those women who were encouraged to leave and be the wives of men, if their husband was a pastor or a leader in the Reformation, they suddenly had a new possible status open to them as the wife of a pastor. So this was another kind of influence and status. It was better than no influence and status. So one person who fell into this category in the 16th century and early 17th century of having new opportunities that opened up for her because of Bible study and because of having a father and a husband who were Bible students was Anne Hutchinson. So her lifespan is 1591 to 1643. She's born in England. She is a Puritan. She wants freedom of religion, and she and her family traveled to New England in order to have more freedom to worship as they choose. When she gets there, however, she's discovering that there's not as much freedom as she had hoped. She's a leader in Bible study. People are coming to her home to study the Bible, both men and women. And the other men in Puritan society are thinking that's not okay. Is she preaching? Is this against the Bible to be doing this? Those are the questions that they're asking. So she runs into opposition for her activities, which are simply studying and reading and teaching the Bible. So she's actually banished from that community and sent to Rhode Island, and where she runs into there are Native American communities that don't like the influx of these settlers and decide to try to wipe some of them out, and she and most of her family are killed. So even though she is one of the few people that was encouraging respect for Native Americans and trying to, she had a much better attitude toward them than a lot of people who were colonists. Anyway, so that's kind of the 16th century. The question for this course at this point is, when did women first notice that they were not equal in society? And when did they start believing that they should have equality? So we noticed toward the end of the last lecture that there were women such as Christine de Pizan who noticed that they were not being treated equally in their society, that they were being put down as all of you women are just like Eve, your problems, you shouldn't be leaders, you're weak intellectually. So there were, Christine de Pizan is one of the women who was most vocally writing and speaking and saying, no, this is not true. So she was very early in doing that. She was in the 15th century. And we also had found earlier women such as Hildegard of Bingen. At this point, I want to bring in a new book, The Creation of Feminist Consciousness, from the Middle Ages to 1870, written by Gerda Lerner. And I think she wrote this in the early 90s, 1993. So her thesis in this book is that many individual women over the centuries, from as early as the 10th century and right up and through the 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, that these individual women started observing, oh, we're not equal in our society. And they started saying, this is not the way God intended it. And they started acting and arguing for equality. So some of the women who started this line of thinking were Roswitha of Gandersheim in the 10th century, Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century, and Christine de Pizan in the 15th century. And of course, Anne Hutchinson when we get to the 17th century. So these individual women began to write and act in public life, even though their society did not approve of women doing these things. These women began to claim certain rights using various arguments. Some of them got visions or messages from God that authorized their unusual activities. Actually, many of them got their authorization directly from God in a vision or a message. Others claimed that they had a sacred right and duty to act because they are mothers and they create life and nurture life and should have a role in society. Gerda Lerner named the process of finding authority to act in the public sphere self-authorization. So whether they got their authority from a message from God, from their status as a mother, from their status within society, if they were a wealthy family or a ruling family. So people like Queen Elizabeth were educated to be leaders because that was part of their family's role as a royal family. So whatever the source, Lerner calls this process of finding the authority to do something in the public sphere self-authorization. The problem, though, with all these centuries of one woman here and one woman there discovering or deciding, you know what, it's not really God's plan that women should not have a voice, should not have a role in society, and it's not true that women are evil or like Eve. So these women who found these individual, came to these individual conclusions, the problem was that their ideas and their writings were not passed on to other women in nearby countries or in later centuries. Each one was a light shining alone. So you had a Roswitha here in the 10th century. She's in Germany, but the next person who's really thinking along her lines is Hildegard. 2 centuries later, she's also in Germany. Then you have Christine de Pizan, 3 centuries after that, in France. Then you have Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in Mexico in the 17th century, saying, I should have a right to education. I should have an ability, I should have the opportunity to study, to write, and to be a part of theological and public discourse. But each one of these people was basically alone. She was fighting a battle all by herself. So the question is, how did these women get together? How did we get to today when there's a women's movement, there's a widespread idea that women should have equality within society and in the church and in the home? Well, one of the answers to this development is the Bible, interestingly enough. So many of these women who started to make these claims that they should have equality started with the Bible in defending women's rights and arguing against the idea of women's inferiority. So yes, the idea of inferiority has some biblical roots. So we have chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis, where some people draw the conclusion that Eve caused all the evil in the world. But women who started having access to the Bible and studying the Bible looked at those same chapters of Genesis and they said, wait a minute, it's not all Eve's fault. Why was Adam so passive? What does it really mean that he shall rule over you? Is that a prediction? Or is it a commandment, an authorization for Adam to rule over Eve, or for men to rule over women? So they started to challenge the standard biblical interpretations. One of the women who did this, one of the earliest women was Margaret Fell. In 1614 to 1702 was her life. She was a Quaker woman in England, and she wrote the first full-length scriptural analysis and argument for women as equals in biblical history, having the right to participate fully in worship and in leadership. So she studied her Bible and wrote a full-length treatment of the biblical sources for women's full equality. The next one was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So she wrote the Woman's Bible toward the end of the 19th century. So she did serious biblical exegesis, interpretation and study, and said, you're misinterpreting these verses. What does it mean when Paul says, women be silent? He can't be meaning for all time, because over here in 1 Corinthians 11, he says, wear your head covering when you're prophesying. So these women weren't silent if he was saying, when you're prophesying, do this. So they started actually comparing Bible verses and trying to figure out what Paul really had in mind, and challenging the standard male interpretations of the Bible. Another person who did biblical exegesis was Matilda Gage. So our next question is, when did women first start meeting in groups for the purpose of gaining political rights? So we now have women who are not isolated 2 centuries away from another woman or a couple of countries away from another woman, but they're actually in the same country at the same time, and they're starting to talk to each other, and they're starting to say, we've got to get together, we've got to make some changes in the way women are handled in our society. So these kinds of changes happened in the early 19th century. women began to have networks and social spaces. They started to have access to education, and this led them to getting together more and to reading and challenging and writing, and the whole first women's movement got started in the 19th century. As they talked and worked together, they shared observations about their inequality, and they began to form organizations to work for change. Another big factor in the development of women's equality was the movement to abolish slavery. So the biblical arguments that were being used pro and con on slavery started to also be questioned and applied to women. So some people were using the Bible to say, yes, slavery's okay. Look at this or that verse. And they were saying, look at this or that verse, and women still should not have any leadership roles. But other people were looking at the Bible and saying, just because this was said in the first century doesn't necessarily mean that God is authorizing slavery for all time. So the movement for women's equality really began with biblical arguments. And this is also covered in Clark and Richardson, chapter 12, the development of women's voices through the abolition of slavery. One of these important women was Sarah Grimke. Her birth and death dates are 1792 to 1873. She was a member of the Society of Friends, known as the Quakers. She was the first American woman to study and interpret the Bible from a feminist point of view. She stressed chapter 1 of Genesis, which has male and female created equally in the image of God. She argued that in chapters 2 and 3, Eve was created to be an equal companion, and she argued that Adam and Eve were equally guilty in disobeying God. She said that men's oppression of women was sinful and was not permitted by the Bible. She wrote about the equality of the sexes and used Paul as a supporter for that equality as early as the year 1837. Another big moment in the development of women's rights in the church and society was the moment that Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Lucretia Mott. So Elizabeth was born in 1815. Lucretia Mott was born in 1793, so she was 20 years older. Elizabeth died in 1902, Lucretia in 1880. These two women both attended the World's Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840 with their husbands. They traveled from the U.S. to London for this conference because they were activists in trying to stop slavery. At the conference, they discovered that they were not allowed to speak and to take a full equal role in the conference because they were women. So they said to each other, we've got to work on this. They decided that when they got back to the U.S. and when they had an opportunity, they were going to have to address this problem. So as a result, Elizabeth returned to Seneca Falls, New York, where she lived, and she found through letters that Lucretia Mott was going to be touring and speaking against slavery. So she said, when you get to Seneca Falls, come to my house and I'll invite some other women to meet with you, and we'll see if we can get started on trying to get women the right to vote in the U.S. So their first gathering to work for women's right to vote occurred in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, and the Anti-Slavery Convention was 1840. So it took 8 years till they got around to organizing. That's how equal rights developed as a biblical source and as a source in the abolition movement in the U.S. Another name that I'd like to introduce is Jarena Lee. In 1836, she published an account of her life, and she is arguing that she should be able to teach. And she's studying her Bible and saying, the Holy Spirit has called me, I should be doing the work that I am called to do. She's African American. She's Methodist Episcopalian, so she's one of the first voices that we hear who is speaking for. She's African Methodist Episcopal Church, and they aren't permitting women to preach in the early 19th century, and she is arguing from the gospel that she should be allowed to preach. So she says, nothing is impossible with God. Why should it be thought impossible or improper for a woman to preach, seeing the Savior died for the woman as well as for the man? If the man may preach because the Savior died for him, why not the woman, seeing he died for her also? Is he not a whole Savior instead of a half one, as those who hold it wrong for a woman to preach would seem to make it appear? Did not Mary first preach the risen Savior to the disciples? Anyway, she continues with her arguments. So she's an interesting next step with the development of women's rights. Let's notice a few other names. So we have Ann Lee, who is the founder of the Shakers, and this is a group that got organized in the 18th century, and she was a leader of these people and was actually considered to be a female messiah, such an important leader. Phoebe Palmer, also in the 19th century, was a traveling preacher and leader in the holiness movement in the U.S. Her dates are 1807 to 1874. Ellen Harmon White was a leader in the Adventist Church, 1827 to 1915. Mary Baker Eddy was the founder of the Christian Science movement. She spoke of God as Father, Mother. She was born in 1821, lived to 1910. So all of these women in the 19th century were gaining authorization to speak, to write, to lead, both in society and in the church. Another one closer to home was Amy Semple McPherson, who was the first radio evangelist and the most noted woman evangelist, and her roots were here in Los Angeles. Her dates were 1890 to 1944. And the movement that she started became the Foursquare Gospel, the church that's widely known today. So a few other dates that we need to notice are the first woman ordained in a major Protestant denomination was Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who in 1853 was ordained as a Congregationalist minister. In the early 1800s, Quakers were accepting women as ministers. In 1892, the Nazarene Church decided to ordain women. In 1911, the Mennonites decided to ordain women. In 1916, the Assemblies of God. It wasn't until 1956 that we get the Presbyterians, the Methodists ordaining women. 1970, the Evangelical Lutherans. 1976, the Episcopal Church. 2007, the Christian Reformed Church of North America. Groups that are still not ordaining women are Southern Baptists, Roman Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and others. So this basically takes us from the 15th century to the 19th century. And this is a very broad survey. You could have an entire course on just the 19th century, or on women in the Reformation and the era of witchcraft persecution, or certainly an entire course on women in the 20th century and women in the church. Also, this is just women within Christianity. I'm not in this lecture covering women in Judaism or women in Islam, but we'll get to that. I would like to mention this book by Octavio Paz about Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. So We already mentioned that she's 1648 to 1694, so she's a 17th century woman in Mexico City, who wants to be educated and wants to have a voice in the church and in society. And this book, Octavio Paz, the Nobel Prize winner for literature, studied her life and wrote an entire book about her. And that book has actually been made into a film emphasizing the persecution that she faced. And that book is called I, the Worst of All, Yo, la Peor de Toda. So if you have an opportunity, watch that DVD. Came out about 2007, 2008. So that takes us from the 15th to the 19th century. The next lecture will be on women in Christianity in the 20th and 21st centuries. And the other lectures that we've already covered are women in Islam through the present and women in Judaism through the present. So that's all for today. Thank you very much.